Hello everyone and welcome to this news conference of the Council of Federation. My name is Evan and I'm the press secretary of Premier Legault and I will be handling this event today. Le Premier ministre du Québec, M. François Legault, est aujourd'hui accompagné virtuellement de M. John Horgan, Premier ministre de la Colombie-Britannique, M. Jason Kenney, Premier ministre de l'Alberta, M. Scott Moe, Premier ministre de la Saskatchewan, M. Brian Pallister, Premier ministre du Manitoba, M. Doug Ford, Premier ministre de l'Ontario, et M. Blaine Higgs, Premier ministre du Nouveau-Brunswick. Premier Legault will start with an introduction remarks. He'll then be followed by Premier Horgan, Premier Kenney, Premier Moe, Premier Pallister, Premier Ford and Premier Higgs. Nous prendrons ensuite les questions des journalistes présents ici, mais aussi à distance. Sans plus tarder, je passe la parole au Premier ministre du Québec, M. François Legault.
Bonjour tout le monde. Je vais commencer en français, puis je vais, and then I'll say a few words in English. Je veux d'abord saluer mes collègues, les premiers ministres des autres provinces et territoires. Aujourd'hui, il y a plusieurs premiers ministres qui sont avec nous, mais c'est une demande qui est unanime de la part de tous les premiers ministres des provinces et des territoires. On répète une demande importante à M. Trudeau à la veille du dépôt du budget fédéral. C'est urgent d'agir pour augmenter le financement des soins de santé en augmentant les transferts fédéraux en santé. C'est un problème qui peut sembler technique pour plusieurs personnes, mais ce n'est pas abstrait, c'est très concret et ça a des répercussions majeures sur les services qui sont donnés à la population. C'est aussi une question d'équité entre les ordres de gouvernement. Actuellement, les provinces et territoires ont un problème très important pour financer les soins de santé. Ce problème a été empiré avec la crise de la COVID. Et la solution, on pense que ça passe par une augmentation des transferts en santé sans condition. Une des craintes qu'on a, M. Trudeau a déjà dit qu'il voulait faire des transferts conditionnels. D'abord, on pense que ça ne respecte pas les champs de compétences des provinces et territoires. C'est clairement la santé, c'est clairement un domaine de compétences des provinces et des territoires. Et c'est important là, de ne pas centraliser puis créer des problèmes de gestion dans la Fédération canadienne. M. Trudeau aussi nous a dit, il nous a répété au cours des dernières semaines, des derniers mois, qu'il souhaitait d'abord s'occuper de la pandémie et ensuite du financement de la santé. On n'est pas d'accord avec lui. On pense qu'au contraire, il y a des décisions importantes qui doivent être prises maintenant, parce que les provinces et territoires vont aussi déposer leur budget prochainement, puis on doit se poser des questions sur les services qu'on est capable de financer à la population. Je vous donne l'exemple du Québec. On a augmenté de 8 000 le nombre de préposés dans les CHSLD, mais la question qui se pose, c'est comment fait-on pour financer ces nouveaux postes au cours des prochaines années? Donc, il y a des décisions importantes qui vont se prendre dans les prochaines semaines et c'est important que le gouvernement fédéral fasse sa part. Pour expliquer rapidement le problème qu'on vit, à cause des impacts du vieillissement de la population, des impacts des nouvelles technologies et des médicaments, on a une augmentation des besoins de 5 % par année en santé. Or, la contribution du gouvernement fédéral n'augmente que de 3 % par année. Donc, année après année, la proportion des dépenses de santé financées par le gouvernement fédéral diminue. On en est actuellement à seulement 22 %. Ça veut dire que les provinces et territoires financent actuellement 78 % des dépenses de santé et de la croissance exceptionnelle. C'est la seule dépense, tout gouvernement confondu, qui augmente de 5 % par année. Donc, le problème se creuse année après année. Ce qu'on demande, notre demande unanime est très concrète, très claire. On demande que le gouvernement fédéral augmente sa contribution de 22 des dépenses de santé à 35 des dépenses de santé. Concrètement, ça veut dire que les transferts en santé passeraient de 42 milliards par année à 70 milliards par année. C'est donc une augmentation qui est demandée de 28 milliards par année. Donc, la première chose qu'on va faire lorsqu'on va lire le prochain budget fédéral, c'est de voir quelle part de cette augmentation de 28 milliards a été acceptée par le gouvernement fédéral. Les ministres des Finances des provinces et territoires, avec le Conference Board, ont fait des prévisions, des projections de la situation financière et budgétaire des provinces, territoires et du gouvernement fédéral. Puis ce qu'on voit clairement, vous avez ces données-là dans les documents qui sont remis, c'est que actuellement, à très court terme, cette année et l'année qui va commencer, le gouvernement fédéral a un déficit important, mais la majeure partie de ce déficit est attribuable à des dépenses non récurrentes durant la pandémie. Donc, comme vous le voyez, dès les prochaines années, si on ne change pas le financement de la santé, le gouvernement fédéral va éliminer très rapidement son déficit, va même devenir en surplus, et les provinces vont accumuler des centaines de milliards de déficits annuels au cours des prochaines années. Donc, il y a vraiment un problème d'équité. Les Canadiens, les Québécois, envoient à peu près 40 de leurs impôts à Ottawa, 60 dans les provinces et territoires. Mais actuellement, le gouvernement fédéral finance seulement 22 du problème financier majeur qu'on a, c'est-à-dire le budget de la santé. Donc, on pense que notre demande est raisonnable. C'est une demande qui est unanime, encore une fois, donc ce n'est pas une ou deux provinces ou territoires, ce sont toutes les provinces et territoires pour qui c'est la priorité, le problème le plus important. Et donc, on dit à M. Trudeau, c'est plus le temps des beaux discours, c'est le temps d'agir. I would like to say a few words in English. Today, we'll all have the same message for the federal government. Now is the time to act and increase the Canada Health Transfer. It's essential to do so for those who need treatments across the country. If the federal doesn't increase the transfer, there's a risk provinces and territories won't be able to pay for all the services their population need. At the end of the day, it's the most vulnerable people who'll suffer. Provinces and territories are currently paying 78% of health costs, and this proportion increases every year. Health cost goes up 5% each year, whereas the federal contribution only increased by 3%. So we ask the federal government to increase its contribution from 22% to 35%. This request is reasonable. It's based on long-term forecasts. It's made by every premier of every provinces and territories. So, Mr. Trudeau, now is time to act. Merci. Thank you.
On passe maintenant la parole au Premier ministre de la Colombie-Britannique, M. John Horgan.
Thank you very much, Premier Legault, for that introduction to the challenges
Merci,
that Canadians
Premier
face.
Legault,
I come to you today
pour
from the
l'évocation
traditional
portefeuille
territory of the
canadienne. Donc, je
Lekwungen-speaking
viens
people,
du
the
territoire
Esquimalt and Songhees
traditionnel
First Nation.
des
I join
Nations
with premiers
provinces,
from
entre
across
autres,
the
et je
country,
me
from
joins aux
different
autres premiers ministres
perspectives politically, from different
à travers
regions,
le
with
pays, de
different
différentes régions,
challenges.
perspectives politiques
But
et
we come
différents défis.
together with one common
On se
purpose,
rassemble avec
to speak directly to
un objectif
Canadians
commun,
about
de
the
parler directement aux
importance of
Canadiens
protecting
en ce qui est
our
trait de
public health
l'importance
care
de
system now and
protéger
well into the
notre
future.
système de
COVID-19 has
soins de
brought
santé maintenant
extraordinary
et à l'avenir.
challenges to
Le
Canadians
COVID-19 a
wherever they
présenté
might
des
live.
défis extraordinaires aux
No more
Canadiens, peu importe où
important is
ils
the
vivent.
challenges that that's placed on our public health care system.
Et donc,
It's
les
highlighted the
défis
gaps and the
posés
shortcomings in the
aux services de
existing
soins
formula,
de santé.
and it's led us to bring
Et ça nous
all of
mène
us together today to
tous
speak with
ensemble
one voice to the federal government about the challenges that we face today and in the future. If we look back over the development of Medicare and public health care in Canada, in the 1960s, we had a 50-50 cost share program put in place. By the 1970s, then Prime Minister Trudeau recognized, as did other premiers, that we needed to have a formula-driven system to put in place to make sure that we could manage the sustainability going forward. Again, in the 1990s and into the early 2000s, with the advent of the Romanow Commission, Canadians looked again at our public health care system, looking to continue to sustain it in the current and in the future. Here we are again at another critical pivot point in the future and the well-being of our public health care system. We have come together united, not because we have the same problems, but because we have one common purpose, and that is to protect and preserve public health care. If we can't look at this issue today in the midst of a global pandemic and plan the strategies for tomorrow, next year, and the next decade, we will not be able to meet the challenges as Mr. Legault has laid out for us so eloquently. I believe it's time now to make sure that all British Columbians and all Canadians understand that our public health care system is at risk. It defines who we are. We've seen that graphically over the past 12 months. Were it not for public health care, we wouldn't be in the envious position we are coming out of a pandemic, looking forward to a brighter, more prosperous future. But the costs of COVID-19 are not just today, they'll be for the long term. We have not any idea yet what the long-term costs will be for those who will suffer long-term symptoms from COVID-19. We do not know yet what the cost will be to catch up on the surgeries that have been delayed. Here in British Columbia, in the next 10 years, 1 in 4 British Columbians will be over 65. The impact that will have on our long-term care facilities is profound. We need to develop new programs and new policies for the 21st century. I know the federal government is receptive to these dialogues. I know the federal government is acknowledging the problem. We are here today to say to the federal government, we need to address this issue now in this federal budget so that we can plan here in British Columbia and across the country for the challenges that we all face. I want to thank the federal government for the contributions they have made over the past 12 months. They have been life-saving for businesses, for people, and for communities. But that is a one-time, short-term fix to what has always been a long-term problem. Since I joined the Council of Federation in 2017, every conference we have has focused on the health transfer. And so before COVID, we recognized the challenge. COVID has brought it into graphic light. It's stark, it's profound, and we need to take action. We're here today appealing from every corner of the country to our federal government to acknowledge that in the coming budget. If they do so, Canadians will be grateful, because this is not about governments, it's not about orders, it's not about fiscal federalism, it's about services for people. And the only way we're going to meet the expectations, the legitimately high expectations of the citizens that we serve, is by having a cost-sharing formula that's closer to 50-50 rather than 78-22.
Thank you, Premier Horgan. And now it's time for Premier Kenney from Alberta.
Thank you very much, and thank you, merci François d'avoir organisé cette conférence de presse. I want to join on behalf of Alberta, my colleagues from coast to coast, in calling for fairness in health funding. One of the reasons I understand the federal government has wanted to modify, reduce its share of healthcare funding is because for many years, provinces did let health inflation run sometimes out of control. There were year over year huge increases in spending, and understandably the federal government took a position that it had to see greater spending control efforts on the part of the provinces. I think that was an entirely reasonable position, but we have seen those efforts. I can say that here in Alberta, we've made some really tough decisions. We've just gone through a year of difficult discussions with our medical association, representing our great physicians, coming to a tentative agreement that will effectively control future increases in spending in that area. We're finding savings all throughout our healthcare system, making very difficult decisions in the process. But even in that context, we've had to increase our budget for surgeries by $1 billion above and beyond the COVID crisis, and add hundreds of millions of dollars to address the mental health and addictions crisis that we've been living through here in this province. So even with extraordinarily difficult efforts to control spending, we still have to spend more to address an aging population and a growing population. And the federal government is not participating. It's not helping us carry that burden, even though it has much greater fiscal debt. Now, of course, through much of our modern history, through the past 40 years, Alberta has had the greatest fiscal capacity of the provinces, but that's no longer the case. With 5 years of economic adversity and stagnation, with the collapse of energy prices last year, we are posting record deficits, and we do not have unlimited resources. We want to be able to continue to share with the rest of the country, but for that part of the bargain to work, we need the federal government to do its part of the entire balance within the federation. If the federal government wants to say that it's playing a meaningful role in healthcare, then this is the opportunity to do so in this upcoming budget, in the COVID context, when health matters more than ever. So I do join my colleagues in right across the geographic and political spectrum in this federation and calling for fairness in federal funding for healthcare.
Thank you, Premier Kenney. Now, Premier Scott Moe.
Thank you very much, and I'm pleased to be participating with my colleagues across the country in this very critical discussion at this very critical time. And I agree with Premier Kenney. This is an opportunity for the federal government to participate to a much higher level and a more equitable level in providing health care for Canadians from coast to coast to coast. Ladies and gentlemen, there is no doubt that the pandemic has put an unprecedented strain on our healthcare systems across Canada. We have seen a heroic response from those working in healthcare, in particular those that are working on the front lines of our healthcare facilities. They have stepped up day after day after day, often at times with a great degree of risk to themselves personally. And they have done this to care and to protect for the ones that we love, for our family members. And we are very grateful for their professionalism, for their courage, and for their commitment. At the same time, we have seen patients and families struggling during this pandemic. Some are dealing, yes, directly with the COVID-19 virus and its ultimate impact. Others are waiting, often in pain and frustration, for surgeries, for procedures, for other tests that have been delayed in our healthcare system due to COVID-19. But the challenge of our healthcare system is experiencing today are not solely due to the pandemic. Healthcare across Canada was under pressure prior to the arrival of the COVID-19 virus, and we need to address those pressures, and we need to do so immediately. And that speaks to the opportunity that we have before us here today, because quite frankly, Canadians deserve better. Canadians deserve a healthcare system that is there when they need it, a system that is well funded and is supported by both levels, both orders of government in this nation, not one that is propped up by entirely by the provinces and the territories. And it should not take a pandemic to get us to this point. It shouldn't take a pandemic to get the attention of the federal government on this important topic. The fact is that premiers have been pleading with the federal government for literally decades now to come to the table as a full funding partner. But year after year, decade after decade, the federal share of healthcare funding in this country, it has continued to shrink. Today, provinces and territories cover close to 80% of all of the healthcare costs that is delivered to Canadians, while providing 100% of the healthcare delivery services. The federal government will talk about strategies and standards and other agreements, but these are, to this point, for the most part, just words. What we need is funding to be able to provide the very best core health care that we can to our citizens. I'll provide you an example of one of the challenges that we have here in Saskatchewan, an example in the impact to Saskatchewan citizens and ultimately families. Prior to COVID-19, Saskatchewan was committed to achieving a maximum 3-month wait time in our surgery wait times by the year 2030. And we still want to get there, but we aren't able to do that alone now, particularly when the province covers about 78% of all the healthcare costs, including those in surgeries. In March of 2020, we canceled all elective surgeries, except for the most urgent procedures, and that was due to the COVID-19 pandemic. That allowed our surgical wait list to climb up to about 30,000 people. That's 30,000 families that are waiting for a loved one to have their surgery here in the province. It's an extremely difficult decision to make, to pull back on those surgeries last spring, and we knew it would have a direct impact on people's lives. As I said, our wait time has increased by about 20%. But since March, we're down about 19,000 surgeries compared to last year. The number of patients that are now waiting longer than 6 months has grown to about 81% of patients. And again, those are family members that are waiting. And the number of patients that are waiting more than 12 months is over 200% higher than it was just a year ago. And that is the impact of COVID on families in our province and quite likely across the nation. Saskatchewan is committed to continuing to address the backlog of surgeries that we are experiencing here and reaching our pre-COVID wait time targets that we had, and we're committed to doing that as soon as possible. But this is going to require a significant investment in the tens of millions of dollars in each of the next 3, 4, and 5 years. And this is at a time when our economy is still recovering from this pandemic that we have all experienced in Canada and around the world. And in the meantime, we have citizens, Canadian citizens, that are continuing to wait, and they suffer often from the impact of these delayed surgical opportunities. This is unacceptable, and all the more because we feel it is most certainly avoidable. We can fix this if we work in partnership in this nation. It's time for the federal government to join the provinces and the territories to create a health system that responds to the needs of all Canadians, a healthcare system that is patient-centered, not just pandemic-centered. Thank you.
Thank you. Premier Brian Pallister from Manitoba.
It's an honor and privilege to speak to you from the Manitoba Legislative Assembly on Treaty 1 land and the homeland of the Métis Nation, and to tell you that I think the biggest problem that Canadians can relate to and understand as a consequence of our failure to get this partnership established and strengthened is the wait times that Canadians are enduring. According to the Canadian Institute of Health Information, before COVID struck us, the wait times had grown in the last 20 years by about 2.5 times, meaning you used to wait from general practitioner to treatment about 2 months. Now you wait closer to 6 months. That is unacceptable. Those personal impacts are very, very real. And if you yourself aren't waiting for a test or treatment right now, I expect you know someone who is, and you know how painful and how vulnerable that experience may make people feel. The 1 million+ Canadians that are waiting right now know, and the empathy needs to be felt by all of us. At my first opportunity as a newly elected premier half a decade ago at a premier's meeting, I raised the example with the Prime Minister of a young woman who felt a lump in her breast and then realized that she was frightened immediately, and they then decided that they needed to consult with a general practitioner. They waited. Every day they waited was painful. Every day for her children, for her partner, was full of fear. And then they were referred to a specialist, and they waited again. And then they were referred to a test by the specialist and waited again, and then they waited for the result of the test, and then they sat down with the specialist, who looked across the table at this couple and said to her, "It's too bad we couldn't have caught this sooner." That's the problem on an individual level that we're facing. We're losing people because of our failure to get health care to people sooner, and we need to change that. When I raised this story, a true story, with the Prime Minister, he looked across the table at me and said, "I'm not your banker. I don't need a banker. We don't need a banker. Canadians don't need a banker. We need a partner. We need a partner on healthcare. This isn't the Prime Minister's fault, except if he ignores the problem, and then it becomes his fault. And all of us will pay the price for that. We need a Prime Minister who understands the impact this is having on hundreds of thousands of Canadians every single day. We have had a partnership federally and provincially during this pandemic, and I think it's demonstrated to all of us, I hope it has to all Canadians, how effectively this confederation can work when people commit to supporting one another in a genuine way. We need to do that same thing now. We don't need a banker, we need a partner. And the lengthening waits over the past 2 decades are only going to worsen as Canada's population ages, as the needs of a growing population, a growing Indigenous population, are going to be very real and present themselves in abundance. The after effects of COVID will make a bad situation much, much worse if they are ignored. So I say to my friends across the country and on this call that the post-pandemic pileup is coming, and it's real, and its impact on Canadians and their families and their friends is real too. The time is now. The time was 5 years ago, but the time is now to address this issue and to address it together. Thank you.
Thank you. Premier Doug Ford from Ontario.
In fact, funding for our health system has hit all-time highs. These investments have supported our frontline heroes. They've helped keep our people safe. Now, as we're waiting to get more supply from the federal government, we're laser focused on getting vaccines into arms. Yesterday alone, Ontario administered over 30,000 doses, a new daily record. That's 30,000 more people who are better protected against this awful virus. Friends, when we finally turn the corner on this pandemic, there'll be two top priorities ahead of all Canadians. We need to rebuild our economy and restore our health system. Ontario is already laying the groundwork to jumpstart our economy. But mending a health system that's already stretched to its limit will be no easy task. Wait times for backlog surgeries are growing. That means more people waiting longer for key surgeries, waiting longer for cataract surgeries, waiting longer for knee replacements. And too many people are struggling with their mental health. And our long-term care homes, neglected for decades, are in desperate need of more support. But folks, here's the good news. If the federal government works with the provinces, if Team Canada comes together, there's nothing we can't do. My friends, a lot of numbers get thrown around when we talk about the Canadian health transfer. But let me make this very clear for Canadians by looking at long-term care. For every long-term care resident, Ontario provides $76,000 each year and growing. The federal government's latest proposal would only provide $2,500. You heard me right, $2,500. The math doesn't work. In Ontario alone, 40,000 seniors are waiting for long-term care beds. We're adding beds as fast as we can. In fact, we expect 30,000 more beds starting in 2022. And we're the first province in Canada to commit to providing 4 hours of care to residents. But meeting this commitment will take time as we recruit and train more nurses and personal support workers. Just imagine what we could do together if the federal government stepped up as a true funding partner. We could build beds faster. We could train an army of nurses and PSWs that much sooner. Canadians can't keep waiting for better health care. Make no mistake, Ontario will always do whatever is needed to protect our people's health and well-being. And as you've heard from my fellow premiers today, they're also doing everything in their power to protect their residents and improve healthcare in their provinces. But the reality is, no province can do this alone. And now more than ever, we need national unity. We need to be united as a country when it comes to fixing healthcare for all Canadians. Because rebuilding after a once-in-a-century pandemic requires all hands on deck. So I'm proud to join my fellow premiers today to ask the Prime Minister to do what's right and call on the federal government to increase its share of the total healthcare spending to 35% and to maintain this level over time with a minimum annual escalator of at least 5%. It's time for the Prime Minister to step up, to work with the provinces and become a true funding partner. Because when Team Canada works together, nothing can stop us. Thank you, and God bless the people of Canada.
Thank you. And Premier Glenn Hicks from New Brunswick.
Thank you. First of all, I want to say that I too have very much appreciated the Government of Canada's support throughout this pandemic. However, the Prime Minister has told Canadians that federal funding for healthcare must be increased, but not right now. He says we should wait until the COVID-19 pandemic has ended before negotiating new funding arrangements for healthcare. If this is not the time to talk about healthcare, when would that be? Les gens de New Brunswick ne peuvent pas attendre pour avoir de meilleurs services de soins de santé. Les Canadiens ne peuvent pas attendre. Les Canadiens méritent de savoir que leurs services de santé sont viables et garantis pour que les soins soient disponibles lorsqu'ils en auront besoin. We are now at a crossroads for healthcare in Canada. An immediate increase in the Canada Health Transfer will enable provinces and territories to maintain and secure current services during this pandemic, but also prepare for the challenge that an aging population will bring. We know that the Canadian society is aging, but the pace of this change differs from province to province. New Brunswick population and that of my neighboring Atlantic provinces are aging at a faster pace than all other provinces. An older population means more people requiring more healthcare services. New Brunswick is already seeing the impact of this change. We are falling behind other jurisdictions in our ability to provide important healthcare services. Only 45% of New Brunswickers can currently receive a hip and knee replacement within 6 months, compared to 72% for all of Canada. We are currently investing significant dollars to get to the national standard. We are focused on delivering quality of aging care services that exceed national standards and allow seniors to live where they want to and live there longer. We must recruit and retain the next generation of doctors, nurses, and other healthcare professionals who will deliver these services and care for our people. Most importantly, we must ensure equal standard of care exists across this country, because that is the intent of the Canada Health Act. Puisque cette vague démographique va frapper le Nouveau-Brunswick, nous travaillons afin de nous assurer que nos personnes âgées puissent continuer à vivre dans la dignité, en sachant que leurs besoins en matière de santé seront satisfaits. An aging population isn't the only challenge we're facing. There are so many others, including the increasing demand for mental health care. Just recently, a 16-year-old girl in our province took her own life after she was unable to access the services that she needed. The federal government needs to invest in healthcare for Canadians in a way that allows each province and territory to fulfill their obligation to deal most effectively with the challenges that each of us face. The federal government has demonstrated the fiscal capacity to make these investments just as they have done throughout the COVID-19 pandemic. La prochaine budget fédéral sera l'occasion de renouveler nos ententes financières et d'obtenir des services de santé pour les Canadiens, dès maintenant et pour les années à venir. Les Canadiens ne peuvent attendre. We need to have stability, consistency, and reliability in long-term care of our Canadian citizens. This obligation is so much more than a political statement. And every provincial and territorial leader are fully aligned on this request. This is about protecting what Canadians value more than anything else, our national healthcare system. Thank you. Merci.
Merci. Et un mot de conclusion du Premier ministre du Québec.
Oui, donc je veux remercier mes collègues, les premiers ministres des autres provinces et territoires, d'avoir accepté de livrer ce message unanime aujourd'hui. On a tous la même priorité, c'est-à-dire financer les soins de santé de façon correcte. C'est la priorité non seulement des premiers ministres, mais la priorité de nos citoyens. Notre demande est claire. Le gouvernement fédéral doit faire plus. Il a les moyens de faire plus. On demande donc que la contribution du gouvernement fédéral passe de 22 % des soins de santé à 35 % des coûts en santé dans les provinces et territoires. So I want to thank my colleagues from provinces and territories. The message for the federal government is clear, and it comes from coast to coast. Our health system faces a financial problem, a major financial problem, and the federal government has the solution. We must increase health transfer from the federal government from 22% to 35%. Ottawa can and must do its part. Thank you. Merci.
Nous allons maintenant passer à la période de questions. We will now take questions from journalists. Pour celles et ceux qui sont présents virtuellement, veuillez s'il vous plaît lever la main sur votre application. So for those who are present virtually, please raise your hand on the application. Vous êtes très nombreux aujourd'hui sur l'application, donc on vous demanderait s'il vous plaît de faire ça le plus rapidement possible. On ne pourra pas prendre toutes les questions et on va limiter donc à une question par journaliste uniquement sur le sujet du jour. There are many of you today, so we won't be able to take all questions. So please limit yourself to one question per reporter and only on the topic of the day, please. Et please clearly indicate to whom your question is directed to. On va débuter d'abord par les journalistes présents ici. On va avoir Marco Beller-Cirino du Devoir.
Oui, bonjour à vous tous. Vous n'êtes pas sans savoir, messieurs les premiers ministres, que le déficit anticipé par le gouvernement fédéral cette année s'élèvera à environ 330 milliards de dollars. Vous réclamez aujourd'hui l'injection de 28 milliards de dollars supplémentaires par année, indexés. Que se passera-t-il si le gouvernement de Justin Trudeau vous dit non? Est-ce que les provinces vont augmenter leurs taxes et leurs impôts? Est-ce que ça milite notamment en faveur d'une révision, M. le Premier ministre de l'Alberta, M. Kenney, de la formule de péréquation? Qu'est-ce qui va se passer si M. Trudeau vous dit non?
Je peux peut-être commencer, puis ensuite laisser la parole à Jason. Bon, d'abord, ce qui est important de dire, c'est que le déficit actuel du gouvernement fédéral, la majeure partie est non récurrente. Donc, vous avez dans le communiqué de presse une projection au cours des prochaines années, puis vous voyez que très rapidement, il y a une forte diminution du déficit prévu à Ottawa, mais une forte augmentation du déficit prévu dans les provinces. Donc, ce qu'on voit, c'est qu'à moyen terme, si le gouvernement augmente ses transferts fédéraux de 22 à 35 %, il y aura équité, c'est-à-dire que le déficit prévu, qui éventuellement devient surplus au fédéral, sera comparable dans les provinces et territoires et dans le gouvernement et du côté du gouvernement fédéral. Donc, c'est vraiment l'équité. Il faut être très prudent parce que la grande partie des dépenses qui ont été annoncées en 2021 puis 21-22 par le gouvernement fédéral sont des dépenses non récurrentes.
Premier Kenney?
Oui, et évidemment, je suis d'accord avec François à cet égard. Nous n'avons aucune intention d'augmenter les impôts, particulièrement parce que nous sommes dans une récession historique maintenant qui est particulièrement grave en Alberta à cause de chute des prix de l'énergie l'année dernière, qui a créé un déficit ici de presque 20 milliards de dollars qui est sans précédent. Mais cela étant dit, vous avez soulevé la question de péréquation. Ça, c'est une autre question que, évidemment, on va continuer à lutter pour équité fiscale Cette province a contribué plus de 600 milliards de dollars depuis l'année 1960 au reste du Canada, au reste de la fédération. Et nous voulons continuer à jouer ce rôle-là, mais dans une crise comme maintenant, nous demandons que le gouvernement fédéral augmente le programme de stabilisation fiscale qui est là pour les provinces qui ont une chute tout à coup dans leurs revenus, comme nous avons ici. Et j'apprécie l'appui de toutes les autres provinces à cet égard.
Merci. On va passer à Raphaël Pirot de l'agence QMI.
Bonjour, M. Legault. Je me demandais, en fait, concernant la stratégie de vaccination pour le vaccin d'AstraZeneca. Hier, évidemment, le gouvernement fédéral, en fait, l'agence publique de santé n'a pas interdit, en fait, la vaccination d'AstraZeneca aux personnes de 65 ans et plus. Mais ce n'est pas encore clair, là, la stratégie de Québec concernant ça. Je voulais avoir votre réponse là-dessus.
Bon. Je vais répondre rapidement à votre question, mais on n'est pas tout à fait sur le sujet du jour. Mais d'abord, on veut utiliser les vaccins d'AstraZeneca. On veut les utiliser de façon sécuritaire. Donc, on va suivre les recommandations de la santé publique. On devra avoir des suggestions. Je voyais aujourd'hui que certains pays en Europe vont même l'utiliser pour les plus de 65 ans. Donc, on attend d'avoir les avis, mais c'est clair qu'on veut utiliser ces vaccins-là puis les utiliser de façon sécuritaire.
On va se limiter aux questions concernant les transferts fédéraux en santé. On va y aller avec Véronique Dubé de TVA Nouvelles.
Bonjour. En fait, le premier ministre Trudeau semble vouloir tenir mordicus à ces normes pan-canadiennes en CHSLD. Là, vous dites, c'est de l'ingérence. Est-ce qu'il y a une façon de réconcilier les deux, de trouver une mesure entre les deux de votre côté?
Bien, le problème qu'il y a, c'est que les priorités sont différentes d'une province à l'autre. Puis les gestes qui ont été posés jusqu'à présent sont différents d'une province à l'autre. Prenez justement les soins de longue durée. Le gouvernement du Québec a déjà investi plus de 500 millions juste pour l'embauche de préposés dans les CHSLD. Donc, M. Trudeau ne peut pas dire « je vais vous donner de l'argent en autant que ça soit investi ». C'est déjà investi. Là, le problème qu'on a, c'est la récurrence. Donc, c'est pour ça qu'on a besoin, puis pense que pour une gestion efficace, c'est souhaitable que le champ de compétences des provinces et territoires soit respecté.
We'll take a last questions on the floor from CBC Montreal, Verity Stevenson.
If you don't get the funding from, if Trudeau says no, basically, what will happen to the 8,000 PABs that you mentioned that you hired this year?
Of course, as you know, we have a minority government. So we've already met with the representatives of the opposition parties in Ottawa. I think if we're not able to settle all the problems in the next budget, we'll continue because it's clear the federal government will have the money available in the next few years to finance more of the health costs in provinces. And I think it's the top priority of Canadians. And I think it's important before announcing new programs in other areas that we first settle this problem, which is the top priority of Canadians.
So you won't cut those positions?
We won't cut what?
You won't cut those positions, the 8,000 positions?
We don't want to do so. We need so, but right now, like in other provinces, we have a structural deficit in the province of Quebec. You'll see that in our budget. So that's why we need a larger contribution from the federal government.
We'll now take questions online. Just a reminder to raise your hand so I can see if you have questions for the premiers. We'll start with Jeff Gray from the Globe and Mail.
Can you hear me now? Sorry about that.
Yeah.
I just wanted to ask about where this longstanding demand for the health transfers, how does that fit in the priorities with the other things that I'm sure you're asking for from the federal government? This need for sort of a renewed safe restart agreement and money for municipalities for other costs that are directly related to the pandemic.
Okay. We had a press conference a few months ago, and we said all together that we have three priorities. The first one is this one. The second one is the one that was mentioned by Jason about a stabilization program to help provinces having a drastic drop in their revenues. And the third one is about infrastructures, including in large cities like in Toronto. So these are our three demands to the federal government, but the top one and the one we're talking about right now is about increasing the financing for health costs.
As a follow-up to that, just would you counsel doing something that the UK has said it's intending to do, which is the largest corporate tax increase the UK has had in decades, in order to pay for this healthcare increase?
But as you see in the projections that we gave to you in our press release, we forecast and we use the assumptions of the conference board that the federal government will eventually be in a surplus position. So I think that it's important that this surplus be used for the top priority of Canadians, which is health expenses.
We'll now go to, Jason Kenney.
On that one,
Yeah.
Sorry, Francois. Just to say that actually here in Alberta, we recently reduced taxes on businesses because we're not just dealing with the pandemic and the health crisis, but also with the largest recession in nearly a century. It's hit us especially hard here. And we need growth, we need investment for both provincial and federal governments. If we're going to get our way out of these COVID era deficits, we need economic growth. So at least I'll speak for Alberta. We don't think that raising taxes and deterring investment would be the right approach.
We'll now switch to Arthur White-Crummy from the Regina Leader Post.
Hi, thanks so much for the time. This will be for sorry, I have a bit of a stutter for the Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe. I just wanted to ask, how do you feel with regards to this funding boost that you're actually calling for, that it would come in a way that it was streamed towards long-term care and also pharmacare and those kinds of dedicated streams, and that it may come along with some kind of a national sort of overall standards for long-term care?
I think those are, thank you, Arthur. Those are important initiatives. Long-term care, mental health and addictions, pharmacare, those are all important initiatives. And I understand why the federal government might want to prioritize those initiatives. But the fact of the matter is that we need a full funding partner in the very core services that our healthcare systems are delivering across this nation. Now, whether the government remains where they are at about a 20 or 22% partner, the federal government, or whether they take this opportunity that's being provided to them yet again today to increase that to be a full funding partner in providing healthcare to Canadians across the nation and increase it to 35% and keep it there, it is still going to be the provinces that are going to deliver this healthcare. Premier Legault had alluded to earlier, he's had to hire at least 8,000 additional healthcare workers, provincially employed additional healthcare workers, to address some of the challenges that he's having in his province of Quebec. We are all faced with similar but diverse challenges across the nation. And that's why we need the federal government to step up and correct what has been a decades-long challenge in becoming a full funding partner in providing the very core services of healthcare in our communities across this nation. We have a surgical wait time in Saskatchewan that we need to address over the course of the next number of years. That's going to take some investment. We all have, I think, an increasing conversation and increasing services, to Blaine Higgs' point, in the area of mental health and addictions, and how we are going to work with our communities to support those family members that may be struggling with mental health and all too often the subsequent addictions. Long-term care is going to continue to is going to continue to need investment now and into the future. Doug had shared the costs of a long-term care resident in Ontario and what the relative cost of the federal program actually amounts to in relation to the total cost of our long-term care residents in our communities across Canada. So those are important initiatives. I understand why the federal government would prioritize them. They most certainly need to be above and beyond the consideration and the opportunity that the federal government has to be a full funding partner in the very core services of healthcare that we're providing Canadian residents.
We'll go with Louis Blois from Radio-Canada.
Oui, bonjour. Une question pour M. Legault, mais les autres premiers ministres peuvent répondre également. M. Legault, à Ottawa, il y a beaucoup de rumeurs d'élections printanières au niveau fédéral. D'abord, je voudrais savoir si vous pensez que c'est le bon moment en temps de pandémie, alors que tous les Canadiens ne sont pas vaccinés, de tenir une élection. Mais concernant vos demandes sur les transferts, avez-vous l'intention de vous faire entendre pendant une éventuelle campagne électorale, profiter de cette occasion-là pour répéter vos demandes?
Bon, évidemment, notre souhait premier, ça serait que M. Trudeau réponde positivement à notre demande dans le budget qui va être déposé dans les prochaines semaines. Si ce n'est pas le cas, bien, on va poursuivre, on va continuer à faire nos demandes. Puis s'il y a une élection fédérale, bien, effectivement, on interpellera tous les partis d'opposition. Déjà, j'ai eu l'occasion au cours des dernières semaines de rencontrer tous les chefs des partis d'opposition à Ottawa pour leur faire la même demande. Et donc, il y aura un débat, mais je ne me mêlerai pas de la stratégie là, puis du moment où il y aura une élection à Ottawa.
On va passer à Catherine Lévesque de la Presse canadienne.
Oui, bonjour à vous tous. J'aimerais poursuivre dans la même lignée, Monsieur Legault. Je comprends que, bon, vous réitérez cette demande depuis plusieurs mois. S'il n'y a rien qui vous satisfait dans le prochain budget, c'est quoi la prochaine étape? Est-ce que vous avez tenté de défaire le gouvernement Trudeau? And if I can just quickly ask Premier Pallister, you said something about the Prime Minister saying, I'm not your banker. Can you just provide more context about that? Merci.
So do you want to start, Brian?
Go ahead, François.
OK. Donc, bien écoutez, c'est sûr qu'actuellement, la demande qu'on fait est raisonnable. C'est-à-dire que ce n'est pas acceptable que la dépense, la seule dépense qui augmente de 5 % par année, que les provinces et territoires doivent en supporter 78 %, puis que ce pourcentage-là augmente à chaque année. C'est structurel. Les besoins augmentent de 5 % puis les transferts fédéraux augmentent de 3 %. Donc, ça devient mathématique, année après année. Le pourcentage qui est financé par les provinces bien, est de plus en plus grand. Puis à partir du moment où, disons que nos revenus dans les provinces augmentent de 3 % par année, puis que le budget le plus important augmente de 5 %, bien, c'est mathématique. On se retrouve dans une situation de déficit. Puis au même moment, on regarde au fédéral, c'est exactement le contraire, c'est-à-dire que les revenus augmentent plus vite que les dépenses. Donc, il y a une marge de manœuvre qui a été très utilisée en 2021 puis 21-22 pour des dépenses non récurrentes pendant la COVID. Mais comme vous le voyez dans les projections qu'on vous a remises, bien, le fédéral va se retrouver avec une grosse marge de manœuvre dans les prochaines années, alors que les provinces et territoires vont se retrouver avec un gros déficit. Donc, il y a un problème d'équité, là, parce que ce sont les mêmes contribuables canadiens qui payent des impôts au gouvernement et à Ottawa et dans les provinces et territoires. Brian?
Yeah, merci. I think it comes down to thinking with your head in the absence of your empathy is a danger. We're all delivering healthcare as premiers. We are on the front line in respect of being in contact on an almost daily basis with not just the impacts of COVID in this time of our lives, but also with the impacts of healthcare services when they're available, when they're not available. I spoke to a fellow the other day, and he's waiting for a hip over a year. And I asked him how it was going. He said, I can't sit, I can't sleep, I can't work. That is the consequence for over 1 million Canadians before COVID hit, maybe 1.5 million Canadians now, that they are dealing with the pain of waiting. We need to understand that. I don't know why any prime minister would not understand the importance and urgency of dealing with this issue. I don't know why any prime minister would not want to partner with the premiers on something as important as this. I don't know why any prime minister would want to run in the next election on the platform of making wait times longer.
We'll now go to a question from CTV.
Hi there, Kristen Ajikoli with CTV National News. My apologies for this not being a question about health transfer, but this is a vaccine question. For the premiers who have recently pivoted to delaying second doses by 4 months, are you basing this decision on NACI's advice, or what else is informing this change in rollout strategy? And I can leave the answer to any premier who wants to answer that, who applies.
John, do you want to answer? Good answer
Sure.
for John.
Sure, I'm happy to answer that question. Dr. Bonnie Henry, the public health officer here in British Columbia, brought, when we learned of the federal government's approval of AstraZeneca, that puts in stark contrast the challenges that we had to meet the expectations of British Columbians to get our rollout up to full speed. We have been depending on outsourcing these vaccines, as we all know. And that means the federal government has worked hard to get the vaccines to us in the provinces. Dr. Henry looked at the opportunity to vaccinate more people faster. She consulted with her colleagues across the country. She consulted with the National Advisory Committee. We looked at what was happening in the UK, in Israel, in other places, and it was a pretty simple decision for us to say we want to get as many first doses in place as we can. And as the procurement of the federal government starts to ramp up, in Q3 is the time to go back and get those second shots in place. So we took advice from Dr. Henry as a government. She consulted, as she has on all issues across the world, to see where best practices could be found. We believe this is the right way forward, and I understand the National Committee is confirming that today or has already done so.
And I'll, Jason, and here just reiterate that, I've asked our Chief Medical Officer, Dr. Hinshaw, to take a very serious look at this some time ago when we saw tremendous results coming out of Israel and the United Kingdom. I don't think it's a coincidence that those two countries also have the most successful vaccine programs in the world, having inoculated, in the case of Israel, nearly 90% of their population, and Britain over a third of their population. And they've had, both of those countries have had about a 90-day duration between the Pfizer doses. I understand Quebec has positive experience with this. So yes, we've taken on board the advice of the National Advisory Committee. We have our own scientific advisory committee here, but at the end of the day, it's about, look, I think John's being a little too generous there. I do not think it's acceptable that Canada is 44th in the world in per capita administration of COVID-19 vaccines. I think it's an embarrassment. It is unacceptable, and it is causing lives. We just had an outbreak. We have an outbreak right now driven by the new variant in a seniors residence in Edmonton. Sadly, they just got the vaccine on Monday, the very day that they started to get an outbreak in that center. They should have been vaccinated weeks ago, like they were in similar settings in the United States, Israel, the UK, and many, many, many other countries. And so this is extremely frustrating. And I think we have no choice but to expand the duration, the interval, to get more people covered. The data is pretty clear. You get 85 to 90% effectiveness in preventing major symptoms, even during that duration on a first dose. So it makes perfect sense to us. And I would just reiterate our call on the federal government Stop letting us fall behind the rest of the world. We need these orders fulfilled immediately. And that's also the reason that many of us as provinces are working together to see if we can support development of vaccines here domestically.
I would just say, from Saskatchewan's perspective, and we'll be announcing this shortly, that we are officially moving to the 4-month interval. And listen, there's been two responsibilities. The federal government has had the responsibility of procuring vaccines, which they have done a disappointing job at best. I think is about all we can say. We see other jurisdictions around the world having access to far greater numbers of vaccines than we have here in Canada. You look to the south of us, where they're 20-30% vaccinated in many of the communities south of the 49th parallel. The province's job throughout this has been to administer those vaccines to Canadians as quickly as we can. And I know many of us have, although somewhat variable vaccine plans, they're all about getting those vaccines into Canadians' arms as quickly as we receive them, and we are proving most certainly to do that. As the data has been evolving, Dr. Shahab, our Chief Medical Health Officer, has also been in touch with his colleagues across Canada and around the world, following the evolving data on the interim of the two vaccination shots that are available. And really what we have done is acted on his advice in providing as many people as we possibly can in Saskatchewan with that first dose, to ensure that we are keeping as many people in this province as safe as possible in these early few months. As the access to a larger number of doses comes, then we are going to come in and ensure that everyone also then has access to their second dose in about 4 months' time. So this is about keeping Canadians safe. This is about provinces working with their chief medical health officers to administer as many vaccines to as many Canadians as quickly as we can possibly receive them, and we are doing just that.
I would like to comment on that as well. I think in New Brunswick, certainly we've been very focused on border activities and controls in relation to the former Atlantic bubble, which we hope to get back there. But I think more importantly, to get back to cross-Canada travel. And so for us, that extension for 4 months, in following what has been proven to be an effective protocol for understanding if it's appropriate or not, is going to be very helpful to focus on travelers and rotational workers. And so we can once again get our borders opened up. And considering the fact that, 60% reduction in transmission by those that have been vaccinated is a reality with someone who's had their first dose, as I would understand, it's going to be very effective for us to get back and moving between provinces, as I say, not only in Atlantic Canada, but across the country. And that's what's going to be the true sign of us moving. So this is helpful. And I think more vaccines that are coming on the scene, to have Health Canada reviewing those and expediting the process of approval is extremely important, because we're not focused on next fall, as the Prime Minister said. We're focused on this spring and getting ourselves back to normal this spring. And I think we can do that. And that's going to be a challenge for all of us collectively, but it can be done.
I'll just throw into this quickly and just say, most certainly early days, we wanted to follow very strictly the manufacturer's recommendations. Science was limited even then. The reality was here and in most provinces, we're working with our most vulnerable people at that stage. We're pleased to say that we've now double vaccinated each of the residents of our personal care homes. But let's face it, this strategy has become necessary as a consequence of an absence of vaccines. So that's why we're pursuing it. If we had the vaccines, we would all be able in the next number of weeks to safely inoculate everyone using the recommended strategies. We're departing from that. The question of whether that's wise or not, our public health experts feel the veils are gradually getting lifted away, and that the science is emerging to say this is the right approach to move towards a earlier herd immunity goal. My concerns go beyond that to we don't even know how long the initial vaccine is going to be effective, for example. So we're going to have to look out further, and that's why I and other premiers are very supportive of the idea of moving towards a more reliable supply chain with some enhanced domestic production manufacturing, science that we can use here to develop a greater security and availability in the future of vaccines when we need it, whether it's this pandemic, booster shots next year, or the next pandemic. We're going to be better served than we have been to date with vaccine being available here to Canadians from Canadian sources.
Thank you. We'll go with David Lundgren from Reuters.
Yes, good afternoon. Several of you have expressed frustration with the shortage of vaccine supplies. Given that President Biden has said that the US will have enough vaccine for every adult there by the end of May, as we go into June, are any of you considering reaching out to the states directly or to vaccine companies to accelerate procurement? Perhaps, I don't know, Premier Kenny, Premier Moe, you've both expressed your unhappiness today.
So Ontario and Quebec are co-chairing a interprovincial working group on potential domestic supply. This is what Brian was just referring to. There are a number of efforts in the country. There's 2 here in Alberta, other provinces that are at various levels. Most of them are at stage 1 trials. And we are doing our due diligence on those projects, on their feasibility, and whether they have the capacity to actually do large-scale manufacturing, what the cost implications would be, et cetera. And we're expecting a report back from that working group in a couple of days. You know, very early on, I asked our health folks if there's anything we could do to pursue acquisition from outside the country, for example, of vaccines that the federal government had not contracted with yet. And our legal advice has been that the federal government has the total regulatory control over this, because for any COVID-19 vaccine to be imported into the country requires an approval number to be issued by Health Canada. So they've effectively taken a total monopoly on international supply, which is why we are looking at potentially supporting domestic production as a plan B.
I would just add to that from Saskatchewan's perspective and agree with Premier Kenny with respect to attempting to procure vaccines outside of the nation has proved to be very challenging and to some degree a little bit of a Wild West environment. We've turned our focuses as premiers individually, but also as premiers collectively through the Council of Federation table as well, is to ensure that we are overturning every stone, if you would, to look at what domestic capacity we have, what potential domestic capacity we may have to not only, to Brian's points earlier, to not only address some of the challenges that we see in the next 2 to 3 months, 6 to 12 months, but also, potentially as we go through the next number of years living with COVID and potentially even another pandemic at some point in time. And so we have really turned our eye to ensure that as premiers, we are doing what we can to enhance our domestic supply, to ensure that we can serve Canadians better through not only the next few months, but the next number of years, and never find ourselves in this type of a situation again, where we are looking around the world to procure vaccines, ultimately with very disappointing results on behalf of Canadians, and has brought us to the position where we're talking about 4-month intervals, for example, for the vaccine supply that we do have.
Premier Pallister?
Yeah, I'll just butt in, I guess, again, and just say, yeah, thanks for raising this issue. It's very important. The premiers established and their health ministers and governments joined together in a pan-Canadian pharmaceutical alliance some years ago. And we need to understand that this constitutionally isn't an area that normally is inhabited by the federal government. So as we move forward into the coming year and years, we're going to have to do a better job of buying together in a cooperative manner. If we can have Canadian domestic production, that's most certainly going to help us. But in addition, in the interim period, I can tell you that Manitoba has a stack of rejection letters from major pharmaceutical companies because, of course, the federal government's orders took precedence over our own. But we're going to persist on that front. And we are reaching out also to United States governments at the state level to see what we can do to cooperate there, too. We build things together with the United States. It's a great relationship. We need to look at strengthening it. It's been put to question in recent years, but it needs to be strengthened and supported by us and by our border neighbors as well. So there are opportunities, I think, to help us push some holes through when it is safe to do so as soon as possible, to rekindle that strong, close relationship we have across the country with our American partners. And this is one of those opportunities where we can do things together better, open the border sooner rather than later as a consequence of doing those things.
From British Columbia's perspective, I, of course, support my colleagues around the table about reinvigorating our life sciences sectors, not just here in BC, but indeed across the country. We have here in British Columbia groundbreaking work being done on therapeutics. AbCellera, a company just launched here in British Columbia, very successful with therapeutics for COVID-19. And I know in Quebec, Ontario, and Alberta, the larger provinces have a really, really robust life sciences sector. This is opportunity arising from the challenges of an absence of domestic production. And I think all of us have been talking for months now about how we can kickstart our economic recovery by focusing on those opportunities that have been presented by COVID-19. And this is one of them. In addition, we have a very obviously strong relationship. The Rocky Mountains cuts us off from my colleagues east of me, and we have a good north-south relationship with Washington, Oregon, and California, Yukon Territory as well. And combined, we make up the 5th largest economy in the world, largely, of course, because of California. So we're looking all the time at trying to build relationships here in British Columbia. As a small, open economy, we need to have relationships everywhere. But in this instance, we've depended overly much on the federal government. Jason's quite right. And the challenges are being felt acutely today by Canadians. Having said that, I'm optimistic that with AstraZeneca being approved, this gives us another tool in our arsenal as we launch or roll out our vaccination program. And I'm confident that we'll be meeting our targets that we set in early January. Again, though, the frustration that you're hearing around the table is real, not just by premiers, but by British Columbians and indeed all Canadians. We need to make sure we never find ourselves short again when it comes to providing life-saving therapeutics or vaccines to our citizens. In addition to that, though, it opens up a whole host of other supply chain challenges. Premier Ford was very quick off the mark when the pandemic hit to retool the manufacturing base in central Canada. These types of initiatives out of necessity, I think, will make us stronger coming out of this pandemic.
Well, when it comes to Ontario, and thank you, Premier Horgan, I remember that. I remember getting up there and hearing President Trump saying he was going to cut us off with the 3M mask. And I said, never again in this country are we going to rely on foreign leaders or foreign countries when it comes to PPEs. And sure enough, with the support and collaboration, all the premiers right across the country, we are now self-sufficient. Right here in Canada, no matter if it comes to the N95 masks or surgical masks or gowns or face shields, we don't have to rely on anyone. And this is very similar to the vaccines. That's why right here in Ontario, again, we're working collaboratively with all provinces to make sure that we have manufacture of vaccines right here in this province. Not necessarily even for this round, but maybe a booster shot, vaccines for cancer vaccines. But again, you really see who your friends and foes are. Our closest ally in the entire world, our closest friend, United States. I thought I'd see a little bit of a change with the new administration, but again, it's every person for themselves out there. We have the smartest, the brightest people anywhere in the world right here in Ontario, and we're going to make sure that we manufacture vaccines somewhere here in Canada, but we're going to work together. And when it comes to the health transfers, what we're looking for is national unity. We need Canadians to come together. And that's what we're asking for, because when we're united, no one can stop us, no matter if it's making PPE, no matter if it's making vaccines, but we need a united Canada. And hopefully we're going to be able to get this agreement worked out with the federal government and the Prime Minister.
Maybe I will add also that for me it's clear it has to be the last time we're in this situation where we have to rely on others for PPEs or for vaccines. So it's probably too late for this time. But if there's a pandemic in the next few years, another one, it's clear we have to be ready, and we have to start working right now to have our own installation, our own plants, and be independent.
We'll go with Anja from National Post.
Yes, hello. Premier Legault, you said you have been meeting with opposition parties to discuss the health transfer. Can you tell us more about those meetings, and have any of the opposition parties committed to to fulfilling your request if they're elected?
Okay, I think that if I remember correctly, the NDP and the Bloc Québécois are ready to support us, including the amount of 28 billion. The Conservative Party is ready to support the principle of increasing transfer without conditions, but they haven't settled what would be the amount. And that's about it.
In my conversations with Mr. Singh and Mr. O'Toole, as all of us have been doing, whenever we have an opportunity to speak to federal representatives, we make the case for a new vision, a new pivot to make sure that we have public-funded health care for Canadians now and well into the future. And both of those leaders in my conversations, again, as Premier Legault said, confirmed they understood what we were saying, and I suspect that the federal parliament is pretty much united on this. It's configured with people from across the country. We need vision on this question. We need to make sure that what we have today is better tomorrow, and the only way we do that is if we restart the partnership, and it is not going to be sustainable in its current form.
On va prendre une dernière question de Marco Beller-Cirino.
Justement, sur vos discussions avec les partis d'opposition à la Chambre des communes, avez-vous l'assurance aujourd'hui qu'ils battront le prochain budget du gouvernement Trudeau s'il n'inclut pas une hausse substantielle des transferts en matière de santé?
Je n'ai pas eu ces discussions-là avec les chefs. Là. Tout ce que j'ai eu comme discussion, c'est je leur ai demandé quelle est leur position sur notre demande d'augmenter les transferts de 22 à 35 %, donc de 28 milliards. Ce que je sais, c'est que le Bloc québécois et le NPD sont d'accord avec le montant. Le Parti conservateur est d'accord avec le principe, mais n'a pas encore établi quel serait le montant. Maintenant, pour ce qui est de la stratégie concernant le budget, je n'ai pas discuté de ça avec les chefs.
Par cohérence, on peut s'attendre à ce qu'ils votent en défaveur du budget s'ils n'incluent pas une hausse substantielle du transfert.
Il faudrait leur poser la question. Okay.
Merci beaucoup tout le monde. C'est ce qui met fin à la conférence de presse. Thank you everyone.
Thank you everybody. Thank you.